Hello, and welcome to Spotlight on Asian Pacific Americans. Today, we will be exploring the life and legacy of Ruth Asawa, Japanese-American sculptor recognized for her wire sculptures, public commissions, and her activism in education. Ruth Asawa was born in 1926 in Norwalk, California. She was one of 7 children. Her parents were immigrants from Japan and operated a truck farm until the Japanese-American internment during World War II. As a child, she loved art and in particular enjoyed looking at different lines, shapes, and spaces. As an adult, she was an American sculptor. Ruth Asawa's work is in the collections of many museums across the United States and around the world. 15 of her wire sculptures are on permanent display in the Tower of San Francisco's De Young Museum in Golden Gate Park, and several of her fountains are located in public spaces in San Francisco. Asawa was an arts education advocate and the driving force behind the creation of the San Francisco School of the Arts, which was named the Ruth Asawa San Francisco School of the Arts in 2010 in tribute to her. Before we get started, let's talk a little bit about the Asia-Pacific region. Asia is the largest continent of our planet, both in size and in population. More than 4.6 billion people live on the continent of Asia. That includes 48 countries. An Asian Pacific American is an American that is of Asian or Pacific Islander descent. People may choose to use this term to identify themselves, but not every Asian American does. According to the 2019 Census population estimate, there are 18.9 million Asian Americans living in the United States. Asian Americans account for 5.7% of the nation's population. Ruth Asawa was a Japanese American. That means her parents were born in Japan but settled in the United States where Ruth was born. Japan is an island country in East Asia. It is surrounded by the Sea of Japan and the Pacific Ocean. It is made up of 5 main groups of islands: Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, Kyushu, and Okinawa. But Japan comprises of 6,852 islands extending along the Pacific coast of Asia. 73% of Japan is made up of forest land. The United States is about 25 times as big as Japan. The capital and the largest city of Japan is Tokyo. Japanese Americans are Americans of Japanese ancestry. Japanese Americans were among the 3 largest Asian American ethnic communities during the 20th century, but according to the 2000 census, they have declined in number to constitute the 6th largest Asian American group. The largest Japanese American communities were found in California and Hawaii. People from Japan began migrating to the U.S. in significant numbers following the political, cultural, and social changes happening in Japan in 1868. These early immigrants came primarily from small towns and rural areas in the southern Japanese region. After the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States declared war on Japan and entered World War II. Not long after the attack, on February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed an executive order that allowed the military to force people of Japanese ancestry into internment camps. Around 120,000 Japanese Americans were sent to these camps. Internment camps were sort of like prisons. People were forced to move into an area that was surrounded by barbed wire. They were not allowed to leave. The camps were made because people became paranoid that these Japanese Americans would help Japan against the United States after the Pearl Harbor attack. They were scared that they would sabotage American interests. However, this fear was not founded on any hard evidence. The people were put in the camps based only on their race. They had not done anything wrong. It is estimated that around 120,000 Japanese Americans were sent to 10 camps spread out around the western United States. Most of them were from the West Coast states like California. They were divided into 3 groups, including the Issei. These are people who had immigrated from Japan. The Nisei, people whose parents were from Japan, but they were born in the United States. And the Sansei, third-generation Japanese Americans. Entire families were rounded up and sent to the camps. Around a third of the people in the camps were school-age children. Schools were set up in the camps for the children, but they were very crowded and lacked materials like books and desks. Life in the camps wasn't very fun. Each family typically had a single room in tar paper barracks. They ate bland food in large mess halls and had to share bathrooms with other families. They had little freedom. Ruth Asawa experienced time in the internment camps, but she was able to persevere throughout her lifetime and focus on her art and caring for other people and her community. Now let's learn a little more about Ruth by reading Ruth Asawa, A Sculpting Life. The Center for Global Education has received permission for this reading from Pelican Publishing. The reading includes limited illustrations from the book as required by the publisher. Ruth Asawa, A Sculpting Life. Written by Joan Schoetler and illustrated by Tracy Van Wagner. Aiko Asawa runs between rows of tomatoes and peppers on her parents' Southern California farm. She stops to look at a dragonfly and the colors and patterns of its see-through wings. She studies spider webs and dangling fruit. Her toes touch the ground as her legs dangle over the edge of a horse-drawn leveler. She uses her toes to draw and delights in making wavy lines and hourglass shapes. At home, Aiko speaks Japanese and is called by her Japanese name. At school, she is known as Ruth, her American name, and signs Ruth on her polar bear picture. She is proud when it is put up for display. Her third-grade teacher encourages Ruth's artistic talent. Ruth wins a school competition for her drawing of the Statue of Liberty, representing what it means to be an American. On Saturdays, Ruth attends Japanese school with other Japanese American children. Empty space is as important as strokes, her calligraphy teacher tells her. She paints black ink on white paper with single strokes. She studies lines, curves, and spaces around her. Ruth works with her parents on their farm. She coils string on bean poles, weaving designs with knots. She loves to daydream and work by herself. During World War II, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. Japanese Americans on the West Coast are rounded up and sent to prison-like camps. Ruth's father is forced to leave the farm. A short time later, Ruth carries her own small suitcase and boards a bus with her mother, brothers, and sisters. For 6 months, they live in a horse stall at a former racetrack. Ruth takes classes from Japanese artists who teach her to look closely at life. Again, Ruth and her family are moved far from the coast. Instead of their farm with green all around, they live in a tar-papered barrack. Ruth studies the lines of people waiting for meals, baths, and mail. She sketches life in the internment camp and pictures of her friends. In art class, Ruth paints on scraps of denim. She hammers holes into tin cans, turning them into metal art. Small rocks decorated with her tiny sketches fit into her hand. Ruth treasures her free time to draw and paint. After 12 months, Ruth receives a scholarship and leaves the camp to become a teacher. She travels to Black Mountain College in North Carolina to study art in studios with famous artists and thinkers. Here, Ruth observes nature and develops a love of learning and of educating the whole person. Milwaukee State Teachers College trains her to be a teacher, but when Ruth is close to finishing her degree, she realizes her Japanese ancestry will make it hard for her to be hired. She leaves without a diploma. Ruth works to make money and travels with her sister to Mexico. In markets, she sees hanging looped wire baskets. A Mexican man teaches her to loop with wire. Ruth experiments using lines, curves, and spaces, and makes looped wire art from a practical technique she learned in Mexico. She twists thin, flexible wire with loop after loop. Ruth builds sculptures of wire and air. It's like drawing in space, she says. Ruth meets Al Lanier, an architect. They move to San Francisco and marry. 6 children fill their lives. She works late at night and early in the morning. Ruth weaves her love of family and art together. When she works on her looped wire pieces, her children play nearby. Ruth's hands coil brass, copper, and iron wires into hanging sculptures. Her children help her twist the wires around wooden dowels or rods to form coils. Using a simple chain stitch of loop after loop, Ruth coils metal into new shapes. She tapes her sore fingers to protect them. They are her tools. Sometimes Ruth loops from the top down, and other days from the bottom up. On occasion, she works inside her piece, creating lines, curves, and spaces. Ruth suspends wire sculptures from ceilings. Smaller forms hang within larger ones. She designs for light shining through her art, casting shadows on walls. In museums and art galleries, people walk beneath the hanging sculptures, marveling at Ruth's looped wire structures. They peer through her art, studying the wires and the gaps between them. "Look at the space that we don't touch," Ruth says. People from far away places buy Ruth's wire sculptures and display her work. Her creations are like no other artist's. Some early reviews of Ruth's work call it women's craft work or Japanese influenced. Ruth ignores these reviews. She continues looping and dividing, thinking about the empty spaces within her creations. Ruth receives many art awards and honorary degrees. Ruth experiments with new art forms. She twists industrial wires together, trying them into bundles like trunks and branches. When her children start school, Ruth remembers how important her art education had been. "Art will make people better," says Ruth. To weave art into children's lives, she co-founds the Alvarado School Arts Workshop, where she teaches, inviting artists, musicians, and gardeners to join her. Ruth helped start the Ruth Asawa San Francisco School of the Arts. Andrea, the fountain in Ghirardelli Square, is Ruth's first public commission. Because it is so close to the bay and she wants to appeal to children, Ruth sculpts 2 mermaids and a merbaby. Large frogs and playful turtles swim and sun themselves. Ruth invites the community to help create her large projects. Rolling, twisting, and sculpting baker's clay, school children fashion self-portraits, buildings, and local landmarks. Ruth has their pieces cast into bronze to create the San Francisco fountain. She folds large sheets of paper to design structures for public fountains, and later the models are cast in steel. Ruth becomes known as the Fountain Lady of San Francisco. In her final public commission, the Garden of Remembrance at San Francisco State University, Ruth honors Japanese Americans sent to internment camps. 10 boulders symbolize the 10 internment camps. A cleansing waterfall washes over the rocks, representing internees returning to the coastline after the war. At the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco, Ruth gazes at lines, curves, and spaces and her wire sculptures. Ruth remembers daydreaming on the farm, learning to draw and looking closely at nature. She recalls making hourglass shapes in the dirt with her feet as a child. Contented, she rubs her hands, made rough from bending wire, folding paper, and working with clay. If you put a seed in the ground, the seed doesn't stop growing. You put it in the soil, and that bulb grows every second that it's attached to the earth. That's why I think that every minute we're attached to the earth, we should be doing something. Ruth Asawa. Author's note. Ruth Asawa spent her life as an artist, educator, and arts advocate. She believed that children should be exposed to art and that professional artists should teach and work with students in classrooms. One time, Ruth had more than 100 children use common baker's clay to create scenes of daily life in San Francisco. She arranged the pieces of sculptured dough into a cylinder that was later cast in bronze. It became the San Francisco Fountain. This picture book is written in gratitude for all the gifts that Ruth Asawa shared. We hope you enjoyed the story and were able to learn a little more about Ruth Asawa. Now let's take a look at the activity sheet in front of you. It's okay if you don't have it, just follow along on the screen. We are going to go through all of the different ways that Ruth showed us that she was a global citizen. You may follow along or take notes on your activity sheet as we go through how she was able to investigate the world, recognize perspectives, communicate ideas, and take action during the course of her lifetime. Let's start with how Ruth took opportunities to investigate the world. Do you remember how Ruth loved to look at nature for inspiration? She would look at the lines, shapes, and textures of insects, animals, and plants around her in the farm where she grew up. Well, she wanted to really learn more about how she could create art that would reflect what she saw in nature, and traveled to Black Mountain College all the way in North Carolina to study art in studios with famous artists and thinkers. She learned to further observe nature and learn from other artists. Therefore, she was able to investigate the world around her. How about recognizing perspectives? Ruth and her sister decided to learn more about the world and other cultures by traveling. They made a trip to Mexico, where Ruth discovered the beautiful looped wire baskets. She carefully studied with a local craftsman who taught her how to loop wire. Ruth recognized that people create art in many different ways and was able to use this perspective to create her own sculptures. When it came time to communicate ideas, Ruth was an expert. She commissioned many of her sculptures and fountains all around the San Francisco area. Each piece of work communicated her ideas about the importance of giving children time and space to explore with art. In her final commission, she honored Japanese Americans who were forced into the internment camps by designing the Garden of Remembrance at San Francisco University. She used her art to communicate her ideas and love for the Japanese Americans in her life. Finally, there were many ways that Ruth took action to help others. When Ruth became older, she remembers how important her art education had been. She created the Alvarado School of the Arts workshop, where she taught and invited other artists like musicians and gardeners. She also helped to start the Ruth Asawa San Francisco School of the Arts. Ruth had a real passion about education for the arts and spent much of her adult life sharing this passion with others. Now that you've had a chance to learn a little bit more about Ruth and learn more about her art, let's review this brief video to take a closer look at her work and her creations. The video is presented by the David Zvorner Gallery. next video will give us a glimpse into how Ruth created her work. It is an excerpt from Ruth Asawa of Forms and Growth, presented by Masters and Masterworks Productions from 1978.
The center out. It's the same principle of the negative, positive shapes that moved me into working in the wire. I always begin from the inside, working inside, and then working on the surfaces inside, and then comes out here. And then when this comes to a certain point, then I begin to work inside, and then go on up. So that the interesting thing about this is that this is the outside surface in here, and then it becomes the inside surface of the next form. And then some of the examples that you could see would be this one here, where the center one is in here, and then it comes out and surfaces, and then goes in again and comes out again and comes around, so that this is a continuous surface. The things that interest me are the proportions that I see. When I'm working on a thing, then I am conscious of this kind of shape out here, and that shape by itself is not very interesting, but when I put one next to it, then I look at this shape that is out here. This kind of form, which is an open form, was sort of inspired by the surfaces of shells.
How about taking a try at creating your own Ruth Asawa sculpture at home? All you need is paper, a marker, scissors, and tape. Watch this video to learn more. Arigato, or thank you. We hope you enjoyed our session today as we explored the life, art, and legacy of Ruth Asawa. Please join us next week as we explore the life and work of Larry Itliong, Filipino-American labor leader who organized West Coast agricultural workers. Thank you for joining us today for Spotlight on Asian Pacific Americans, and we will see you next time.